welcome to another great video. We get lots of great questions and comments, and we like to respond to some of those. And some of them create new videos like this one right here. We had a comment, when does it make the most sense to do the RRSP meltdown? And we're going to cover that today. Before we got to explain, though, what is the RRSP meltdown?
Yeah, I mean, the RRSP meltdown, basically what you're trying to do is take money out of your RRSP faster, because there's a variety of reasons why you want to do this. You don't want to die with a lot of money in your RRSP, period. That is bad because the government's going to take a whole bunch of it. And again, it can go tax-free to your spouse, but everybody else, that's fully taxable. So slowly melting down the RRSP is a big idea to try and drain that thing. And there's a variety of different options for why you want to do this, how you can do this, maintaining tax brackets and everything else that we can get into. But getting that meltdown is basically taking it from a large portion to a smaller portion so you can save taxes in the long run for your estate and anything else.
Yeah, and the idea there, again, RRSP, big tax liability. Because anyone other than your spouse is probably going to be a big tax burden there. And so the idea, if you can chip away at it bit by bit, it'll be a lower tax bracket, save you money in the long run. That's the RRSP meltdown. We've got a whole video on that strategy.
We do.
So we'll link to that. And now today we're talking about when does it make the most sense to do that. The first tip is the size of the accounts. Because remember that RRSP, that's the tax liability. So if you have a big RRSP, well, that's great for your retirement. Also means you really want to consider the meltdown, because the larger the RRSP, the larger the potential tax liability.
That's the biggest factor. So, I mean, basically, if you're going to have a very large RRSP, you're going to have to draw a certain amount out. If you wait until that 71 time frame, that may be huge. So you may want to start doing that earlier if you're sitting there and you can afford to take the money out, depending on what your taxes are or your situation. And it depends on where you want to go. I mean, if you want to take a look at an RRSP, and it could possibly take the money and go to a TFSA or something along those lines, if you have room. Otherwise, you're looking non-registered assets and things along those lines. But that's the biggest factors, trying to get rid of that large tax liability, as you've mentioned, and drawing this down in segments based on a variety of different options.
Yeah, so when does RRSP meltdown make the most sense? The first tip there, the first factor to consider is size of accounts. You mentioned the larger the RRSP, the more you want to consider the meltdown.
That's right.
Also, the more room you have in your TFSA. Because ideally, you take it out of the RRSP or RIF, and since you don't need the funds, that's part of the meltdown strategy, it can go into that tax-free account. That's ideal. If you could just move it over to now, you've dealt with the tax liability in the RRSP. You now have completely tax-free funds, growing, investing you can use down the road. Not everyone has that amount of room in the TFSA. So the RRSP or RIF to TFSA is ideal. If you don't have that kind of room, the RRSP to RIF to a non-registered account, still possible, still doable. You just have a few more details you have to work with there.
Yeah, you have to deal with now in the TFSA, of course, there's never any tax liability for it. Now that you've moved it to non-registered, well, depending on what the investments are, they may earn capital gains, distributions of some format. So there will be some, but it's still better than what you're going to get as pure income coming out of that RRSP or RIF. And doing that, you also want to maintain sort of that looking at where your tax bracket scenario is, right? And you want to make sure that, you could take it all out at once, but then you're paying the same amount of tax if you did it that way. So doing it in smaller chunks, depending on your tax situation, will also help out. And there's a variety of different ways that we want to look at that with like pension splitting and things along those lines.
Exactly. So we had a couple of factors to consider. The size of the accounts, both RRSP and your TFSA room would be one factor. The next is the pension splitting. Like ideally the strategy, if you're a couple and you're both over the age of 65, that's the Goldilocks zone right there. The reason why is because if you're a couple, you can do pension splitting. If you're over the age of 65, money that comes out of a RIF is considered pension income, so it can be split. So now you can divide it over two tax brackets, which will help you both keep within a lower zone.
That's right.
And faster deplete that RRSP. Now, if it's not the case, you're under 65 or you're a single retiree, that's perfectly fine. You can still use the RRSP meltdown strategy. It's just simply the optimal version of the strategy would apply to couples over 65.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you hit it right on the head, the factor that we want to do that over 65, because under 65, you cannot split those RIFs or those RRSPs. It is pure income to you that has to go on. So you mentioned the Goldilocks scenarios there. And again, of course, another factor that might come into this is where's your income base right now? Are you in a low income? Maybe you're just, collecting a small pension or something and nothing else has gone on at this point in time. That's the perfect time to draw the large amounts out, because you can within certain tax brackets and go along those lines. Or you could also look to delay your CPP or OAS, depending on how close to those age brackets you are when you want to start taking. If you're closer to 65, you don't have to convert to 71. Take it earlier now and then delay those things down the road might help out as well.
Yeah, so we're looking at a couple of factors. Size of the accounts, bigger the RRSP, more likely you want to consider that meltdown. The more TFSA room you have, well, the better, more likely you want to consider the meltdown. The pension splitting, that could definitely be a factor. And then the third factor, you mentioned the income level. Ideally, you're in a low income area. Now, everyone's going to be a little different. Each province is going to have a different tax bracket when it comes to income taxes, because they all have slightly different numbers. If you could be, I'd say 35% or less in terms of the marginal tax rate,
That would be great.
that'd be ideal.
Yep.
Above that, you can do it, but the numbers get a little trickier. But if you're below that number for your marginal tax rate, this starts to make a lot more sense.
It does.
And that's what we meant by the lower income. And then one way to have lower income, you defer your CPP and your OAS. So now you're in a lower tax situation. You can draw down more of that RSP. And then if you're at a higher income, maybe you got a great defined benefit pension plan. You're one of the lucky few that have those pensions.
Still left
Or
around.
you're simply still working in your higher income situation. That's not bad. It just means you got to be cautious and run a couple of numbers here to make sure it still makes sense in the higher tax brackets. It's very possible it could still make sense, but the optimal situation here would be you're in a low tax situation. Hopefully you learned from this video. We've got lots of other videos talking about RSPs and RSP Meltdown. We'll link to that guy here. Click on that one. We'll see you again very soon.
Take care.